Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Pollick, and this is Many Moving Parts. I am a registered social worker and psychotherapist, and today we have a little bit of a change of venue. I am in my bedroom because my wife is using the office downstairs, and the other half of this interview is in Texas, and that is Sarah Magie. And Sarah and I go actually a long ways back to the days of Sterling. And well, that's going back 20 odd years now, I would say, thereabouts. And Sarah has an absolutely fascinating story that I'm pleased to talk to her about today. So Sarah, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So thanks so much for that intro, Jason. I feel very old now because I think I was in high school the last time we met face to face.
That's right.
I didn't realize 20 years ago.
A lot of water under the bridge, eh?
There has been in the intervening years. I finished a degree in philosophy from Queens. I continued on and actually followed in my parents' footsteps. You knew my late father, Reverend Dr. Rick Magee, was a United Church minister, and then I followed him into the ministry, and I did a Master of Divinity at Queens, and my ministry path was a little bit different than my parents. I did some internships in pastoral charges and what we call congregational ministry. But then my calling really led me towards the military. So I joined the Canadian Armed Forces in 2015 as a chaplain, and I served about 9 years in the Canadian Armed Forces. I was an important caveat. I was not a chaplain the full time that I was in the military. I actually did a brief stint where I did some infantry training in Gagetown for about a year. But then I recently retired as a chaplain. So I'm no longer in the military as of February of this year. And I'm here I am enjoying retirement in Texas.
Now, I just want to back up for a second because I don't know. There was a period of a few seconds there where you kind of glitched out. We're having some connection issues. So if I can recap and you correct me if I missed anything, because I don't know whether the recording is going to include that glitch or whether it will come out. You got an MDiv and you were on the ministry path and did some ministry, but then were called towards the military and went into military chaplaincy. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, great. So now you have mentioned to me, Sarah, that you have post-traumatic stress disorder. I just presume that that was a consequence of your service in the military. And I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit about your experience.
Mm-hmm. So the interesting part of it is that when you hear PTSD and military, I think the assumption is often that post-traumatic stress disorder is associated with a combat role. And that's not necessarily always the case. And so in my case, my PTSD diagnosis is quite recent and stemmed from harassment that I had experienced at the hands of my supervisor, who was also a chaplain. So it was not sort of the what you might think as the stereotypical, story that led to post-traumatic stress disorder. However, I was posted to CFB Borden in 2022, and I'm going to leave names out here just for individuals' privacy. But
Sure.
Supervising chaplain at that time, who was quite theologically conservative, and I experienced, very sexist remarks, racist remarks. I'm an Indigenous woman. There were comments made against and about the freedoms, basically, that Indigenous people now experience because we're doing the work of reconciliation. And so the perception being that sort of Indigenous people have free reign, and sort of white Western Christian folks have been now oppressed for the sake of Indigenous freedom. And so when that started, I am not one to not say something. And I reached out for help to both superior officers as well as other military resources. And what ended up happening was just a chronological systemic failure of both military policy, but also I'm gonna use a term that's just recently been in psychological research called institutional betrayal. And I see that more with survivors of military sexual misconduct, where an institution fails to act to protect individuals where they should have acted. And that's really where the statistical data lies in terms of that concept. But there was a period of several months where, from officially reporting, I had superior officers try and actually remove me from the base as a consequence of reporting the harassment that I had experienced. I was removed from my team. It looked in our data system like I had been fired because I was removed, and no explanation was given under the guise of protecting confidentiality for both the respondent as well as the person who experienced the harassment. And so it was a very long and arduous process where I was systemically isolated and not given the help or protection that I frankly deserved, as someone who had experienced that and who had provided quite substantial evidence to substantiate that that experience. And so it was just sort of all doom and gloom for like the better part of it. Took from the time that I reported initially in November of 2022 to the time that I retired from the military in February of this year in 2024, that case was still under formal investigation. So there had been no resolution to the situation, no correspondence with me. They knew that my chain of command knew that I was leaving. There was no indication of, hey, we're going to continue this investigation. I'm not sure by policy that they can, because I've now, the victim has left the military. So I now am no longer part of that military system. And so it was just like one series of events after another where the institution let me down, as well as others who were also harmed by this person, but too afraid to come forward. And then the other piece of this, which is really interesting, is there is a faith component, because as a chaplain wearing the uniform, you occupy a space of immense privilege. I have been in my career in the office of generals and advised them on ethical issues and had that advice accepted almost without question because of that position of privilege and trust that I have held. And so this idea of people of faith and or spiritual standing, not all chaplains are members of a faith tradition. We have religious chaplains now as well, but there's this sense that you're sort of held to a higher standard, and there's that faith component where someone who is supposedly held to this higher standard is now perpetuating harm, and there's no consequences to that person. And so that really damaged my own relationship with God and my own faith, to the point where I was unable to attend church for a period of time. I was frankly unable to pray for a period of time. It was just so there was a cognitive dissonance between what had happened, the harm that had been perpetuated, the lack of trust in the system that was designed to help and protect individuals, and it working at every level. In the midst of all of that, I met this wonderful human being who is a registered social worker at the medical clinic in Borden. I'll say her first name is Tanya. And Tanya, if you're watching this, I hope you see this, because life.
You'll have to send her the link.
I will send her the link. And I don't think that she knows how much of a difference she made. This is a woman who, we didn't really talk about faith. Like, I kind of got the sense that wasn't really her thing. And she practiced like a variety of modalities in terms of counseling, EMDR, emotionally focused therapy, and things like that. All modalities that I'd been previously familiar with, just because of my kind of coexistence with the mental health world as a chaplain. And through that whole experience, she was the one that really got me to see and accept what I had experienced, to validate that it was real, to validate the harm that had been done, and helped me to see and to really accept the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress. It's not a stigma, but there is a sense of shame, I think, especially in the military community. If you haven't deployed, if you've never been in a combat situation, you kind of feel like, well, I haven't earned it. Like, I haven't really been in a situation where my life is truly at risk, right? In the same sense that you think of in terms of more stereotypical cases of PTSD. And so I really struggled with that. And one of the things that Tanya talked to me about a lot was this idea of religious trauma. Now, religious trauma is not an accepted diagnosis, if you will. It's not in the DSM-5. It's not like, as far as I'm aware, but it's not like in Canada in terms of like psychiatric diagnoses. That's not something you can be diagnosed with currently. Interestingly, that it does exist in the United States.
Does it? As an accepted like formal diagnosis?
As an accepted formal diagnosis. I haven't seen a lot of publicly available data on this, so it needs to be verified. But that was what I was told anyway at the clinic, that it was like it's sort of a new, evolving, emerging diagnosis, particularly I think in sort of ultra religious areas of the world, maybe where trauma may be more prevalent. And so that was something that with Tanya's help I was able to discuss, and then through this psychiatrist that I ended up seeing, who was like, yep, post-traumatic stress, and it was with these two, both Tanya and the psychiatrist, it was these two sort of secular, non-religious women that sat me down, and like week after week, compassion. Tanya started doing this thing where anytime that I was coming in, I don't know if she did this specifically for me. In my head, it was specifically for me. But she had a whiteboard on her door where she would start putting like little religiously themed jokes on her door. And it was just like a sweet little thing that I would walk by it and I would see it, and we could laugh about God again. And it was like not this big, it didn't have to be this big, deep logical discussion about why a just and loving God would allow this kind of harm to exist in the world, and like all of those things that you're going to wrestle with. But it could be this lighthearted thing where we just kind of slowly introduce this part of my life that was a huge part of my mental health for a lot of years. And that's a huge part of my coping mechanism in my toolbox. It's not going to be everyone's, obviously. But it was something I was really missing because of the nature of what had happened and who had perpetrated the harm. And so that it was this beautiful sort of, I call it like the peeling back of an onion, where we just kind of peel back the layers of the trauma and the things that had happened. And we got to this place where, like, Christmas of 2023, I was visiting family in Texas, and I was able to go to attend church again at Christmas Eve. And that was the first time since that it all happened that I could attend as a worshiper, as not presiding over anything, not in charge of anything. It's not my job to pray here. I could just go and be and sit. And I was a stranger and no one knew that I was a minister. And I just sat in that pew and someone handed me a candle and we lit a candle and we sang Silent Night. And it was just like this really, truly holy moment for me. And that was really special. I think one of the things that I struggled with the most in leaving the military was that sense of loss. And this is something many veterans, you're going to hear this from a lot of people that leave the army or the military, is that loss of identity, right? When you take the uniform off. One of the things that I struggled with as a religious practitioner in that whole time is that loss of community.
Yeah.
Because I didn't have that support system anymore, because there was this block for me in terms of trusting religious people. And there had been other people involved in that situation who were dishonest or malicious in terms of how they handled things and things like that. And it was just all connected to this faith tradition. And it was really, really a big deal for me to be able to go and attend church again and get that sense of community back and get that sense of identity back in terms of who I am as a person. And so that was December. I mean, we're sitting here in April. And that, I mean, I'm still on the journey. Like, you don't like graduate from PTSD, right?
Yeah.
There's not like a, hey, congratulations. You're like,
you no longer have PTSD. Yeah.
But which is like, I mean, if Tanya sees this, she's gonna laugh at me, because this is something we talked about all the time. I was like, hey, am I done now? Like, am I graduated therapy yet?
Am I cured? Am I fixed?
Right. And this is the fun thing about getting, like, seeking help and support is like, I don't know. I always, as a chaplain, I always said to people, I view it a lot like preventative car maintenance, right? Like, we don't wait for the engine to fall out of our vehicle before we go and get an oil change.
Yeah.
And frankly, I had let that slip in terms of my faith stuff. So we're back to preventative car maintenance therapy. But
well, that's great. I mean, and so that sounds like a much better place to be. And I mean, I there's a lot in what you have just said, and I'd like to ask you a few questions before we carry on. So, I mean, first of all, I mean, what a betrayal. You know what I mean? Like, it sounds like there were so many levels, so many places where things could have gone right, where things could have tilted towards justice, and they sort of failed to do so. And I wonder if you have an insight into whether, I mean, this is just sort of endemic to the military. Is it, do you think it was because you're a woman? Do you think it's because you're Indigenous, or a combination of those things? Like, being a, cisgender heterosexual white male, and I have become aware of certain doors that are open for me that might not be open to other people. And I just wonder if you feel that this was just kind of a bureaucratic cock up, or was it kind of like systemic discrimination?
So the one thing that I will say is that I think that evil people exist everywhere in the world, and I think that well-intentioned and competent people exist everywhere in the world. And so I think that the right set of circumstances could have existed in any organization for a similar story to have happened. The fact that it happened in the Canadian Armed Forces, for me, I don't think is an indictment necessarily. This is not a very popular opinion nowadays, but I don't think it's an indictment of the Canadian Armed Forces, and I'll tell you why. Because I also spent some time in the infantry. There was a period of time, sort of partway through my career, where there was sort of a dead end in terms of like where I saw things going as a chaplain and policy and things like that. And I didn't like where things were going. And I had this really wonderful experience as a chaplain at the infantry school in Gagetown, where I experienced leadership And I realize that I'm saying infantry, and everyone who isn't in the military will get a picture in their head of what that looks like, right? You think this sort of gun-toting commando types or whatever. But I really experienced leadership there that was transformative, progressive. I'm going to say feminist, but not in the sort of ultra militant woke sense of that word. I mean, very systemic and of policies and things like that. Even when I was on course, like in the infantry platoon command program, I had a commanding officer who was like a card-carrying member of, like, on the board of the White Ribbon Society in Fredericton. For those who don't know what that is, it's a men's group against domestic violence, but against men perpetrating domestic violence, and brought that group in as like professional development for the mostly all-male course. I think of 9 women that started, 1 graduated. So it's still, there's a statistical problem there in terms of recruitment, but in terms of leadership, I saw a commanding officer, a separate commanding officer at the infantry school, stand up and in a room full of women and say, "What am I doing wrong?" Literally asking everyone from civilians, rank of private, all the way up, to be like, "How can I do better? Because I need help." And I'm doing the work and I'm educating myself. And he was, but he needed more direction. And so when we said, hey, as an example, there's no female student bathrooms on this level of the building. You have to walk twice as far as any of the men. We're missing more class. He left the auditorium that day and ripped all the no student signs off the female bathrooms and things like that. So I don't want to give the impression that this is like, another story of sexism in the Canadian Armed Forces. That's not to say it doesn't exist. It certainly does, but there's a lot of good things that are happening in the military, and there's a lot of really good leaders and leadership, and I've experienced those people firsthand, not just in the chaplaincy, but across many different trades. And I mean, I have similar stories about every unit that I served in. So really, really, I want to leave that on a note of hope. In terms of the military, I think that in a lot of ways I was at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Okay.
The wrong people.
Which I'm sure doesn't make it any better, but nonetheless, no. I mean, and thank you for that clarification. Now, the other thing that you brought up is something that I struggle with as well. So I resonated very much with what you were talking about. So most people know that I used to be an Anglican priest, an Anglican minister for 12 years. And I left the church because of my PTSD, and you were talking about, oh, well, I haven't deployed, I haven't seen combat, how could I have PTSD? I mean, I was a priest, right? Like you don't think of just flat out ministry as being a place where PTSD can happen, but it did, and it does. So I haven't been able to set foot back in a church again. My parents are members of the United Church, as you well know, in Stirling. I'm very familiar with that, and they are the caretakers. And at one point they asked me to go over to help them clean the church, and I walked in, and just the smell of the wood and the candle, I'm just like, nope, not happening. And I still get triggered if I'm watching a show and there is a hymn, playing. So how did your faith shift? Because this is the other thing. It's not necessarily an institutional betrayal, but we think of all of these institutions and beings as being, like I think of the army as the group of people that defend us from evil. So therefore, when evil comes into it, you're like, holy crap, like why? And then God, presumably, God is love, right? You hear everyone say, and then seeing the evil that befalls the world and befalls us as people who served or serve God, really threw me for a loop. So I'd be interested to hear more about how that impacted you.
Yeah, and I am still unpacking that. So I want to caveat this by saying, like, I have none of the answers.
Yeah.
like I want to be able to be like, yep, here's it, like packaged in a nice, like wrapped up with a bow box. But really, I mean, my mantra is God is love, but people suck.
Fair enough.
And I think that that's true in so many organizations, and people suck everywhere. There's atheists that suck, and there are non-religious people that suck. And I just it really took some radical acceptance. I mean, EMDR, huge fan.
Me too.
And I call it my voodoo solution, because I still don't understand intellectually or academically how it works. I just know that it does. And I'm actively not researching it, because I feel like it's one of those magical things that if you understand how it works, then it just stops.
Then it won't work anymore. So I just want to take a little jump off there for anybody listening who is not familiar with EMDR. Eye movement reprogramming and desensitization is what it's called. It was originally developed for, I believe, was it for borderline personality disorder, or it was originally developed for another issue, another mental challenge. But then it was discovered that it actually had a fairly good success rate when it came to PTSD. So anybody who has PTSD who wants to consider EMDR, yeah, it sounds like voodoo. I won't ruin it by explaining what it does, because it is it's magical. If we told you, you'd be like, that's the flakiest shit I ever heard. But so Sarah and I can both attest to the fact that it is successful in diminishing the symptoms of PTSD.
You're gonna feel silly the first time you do it. And I promise that that's normal. But then you just kind of go with it, and certainly that was always Tanya's thing, where she's like, yeah, just go with this. Let's just go with it.
Give it a shot and see what happens.
I learned to live in the moment and follow my brain down these really weird pathways. And so EMDR played a huge role in sort of, they talk about the units of disturbance, or like how disturbing a memory or an image,
like on a
or
scale of 1 to 10 or that sort of thing. Yeah,
exactly. And so it brought a lot of the religious stuff down from like a 7 or for me to like a 0 or a 1. And so that really helped me to shift out and differentiate the people that sucked from like, okay, I don't have to associate every part of this group or organization that it was important to me that I wanted to have back. I want to say that it is really, really okay for people and I'm like, this is my own soapbox for like, as a religious practitioner, that like, if you've been harmed by a religious professional or a faith tradition and you want to walk away and you have no desire to get that back in your life, that is 100% okay. There is no pressure from anyone, myself included, to really go down that route. It was just, for me, it was such a huge part of who I was as a person, my family connection and history, and it was a huge part of my coping mechanisms and the tools in my toolbox, and it was so desperately important to me to get that back. And so that was the work. That was the hard work. I mean, you know this a bit. I also am into like barbell lifting, right? Like I do really heavy gym stuff, and for me, doing that work to process my religious trauma was the hard rep. That was like a for me. And so it wasn't like you don't go into the gym and just squat 600 pounds. You start with just an empty bar, and sometimes it's just by a church or listening to a hymn on a computer or what have you, and doing all of that work. And I am today considering, not considering, I am like working again as a religious service provider. So
really, right? Okay. In what capacity?
I've been mostly filling in, and doing pulpit, what we call pulpit supply, which is just sort of subbing for the pastor on Sunday morning, and providing religious services. But I'm entertaining a contract right now for doing that more permanently. And
Okay. Well, and that's great. And like I haven't gotten there, and I don't think I ever will. I don't intend on ever setting foot behind an altar or a pulpit again. And that's just sort of my journey. I admire anybody who can do that. But I guess for me, and you and I might have had sort of similar experiences. I had this idea of a God who, was tilting in the direction of justice. And just, the last few years with, Trump and pandemics and just, ridiculous politicians and ridiculous economies and wars and all that. I know society's always been sort of messed up, but I mean, I'm failing to see the arc these days, on a larger scale. So it's just sort of like, I don't know. I mean, I have been exploring a little bit more about sort of Zen Buddhism and meditation, and I just find the idea of a controlling deity is something that doesn't work for me anymore, right? There may be something, but I don't know. I like to say I'm trying to find a new container for my spirituality. I still consider myself to be spiritual, but it's just sort of the religious messaging is something that I'm just sort of like, you know what, I can't really get behind that anymore so much.
can I do a book plug?
Absolutely.
Allowed? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, this is not officially endorsed by Many Moving Parts. But there's a book, and I'm gonna pick it up. Just give me 2 seconds.
Go for it. Go for it.
Sorry, this is on my bookshelf because it's one of my favorite books, and this helped me when I was processing a lot of that why do bad things happen to good people sort of deal. And it's a Jewish rabbi, Harold Kushner. I don't know if you can
The
see
Book
that.
of Job, yeah.
Words.
It's blurring out, but it's the Book of Job by Rabbi Harold Kushner.
Yeah, when bad things happen to a good person. We'll link it in the
yes. I will put a link to that. I have read it, and I did find that kind of interesting. I don't know, it hasn't quite settled in my psyche yet. But what was it about that book that you found particularly helpful?
Well, the Jewish tradition in general doesn't shy away from criticizing God, which I really appreciated, in the sense of having space to be angry and having space to question, and there's a lot of lament in the Old Testament. So sometimes there's that pressure to sort of, well, if you were truly pious enough, then you wouldn't struggle with these things, right? That's sort of the I don't know, societal, or sometimes even in the church, that's the idea when you're a pastor, right? And if you're behind the pulpit, you're like, it can't be horrible, or you can't struggle with these things, or what have you. Certainly that was not my experience when I was working in congregational ministry. I had a lot of really great congregational experiences. But it was Rabbi Kushner that really, for the first time since my parents, who were fairly of the ilk as my father, of the ilk of like, everything's gonna be fine. And so, and then I struggled with that, in my sort of teenage years, as one does, I think, in general, when you get angsty and you want to rebel against all things parental. Of like, well, no, but everything isn't fine, right? Necessarily, and whatever you think isn't fine as a teenager is perfectly valid. But when truly horrible things happen in your life, like the trauma that I talked about, having space to just sit down and admit that, hey, God and me aren't cool right now, and that didn't make me, a shitty chaplain or a shitty Christian or whatever.
Well, and this is where I've always I've always enjoyed the Psalms, because in one breath it'll be like, God, you are so awesome because you make the rain to fall, but then why do you suck so much because you also, whatever, gave me leprosy, right? So I mean, it's just the Psalms I've always felt were a very visceral and human way of interacting with God, because like I was raised like you, sort of in the Christian tradition, United Church, Anglican, where God is love and God has a plan for everything and God works in mysterious ways, and that's how we talk everything away. So when bad things happen, nobody ever told me that I couldn't be angry at God. But one of the more liberating things that was ever told to me was that, yeah, you can be angry at God. I mean, theoretically, God knows anyways that you're mad, so you might as well just let it rip. But yeah, like I said, and still, I think, you and I are along with probably many people who have had similar experiences, putting things back together again. I often use the metaphor of, a bucket of Lego, right, that has been tipped over, right? I mean, all the pieces are there. It's just a question of how it's going to get put back together again. But I wanted to talk about religious trauma, and there's a number of really good books out there, and many of them, some of them are very critical of religion, and basically the punchline is stay away from all things religious. I don't think that's necessarily terribly helpful, because religion and faith and spirituality can be a source of great support for lots of people. A lot of other books are just sort of like, yeah, like you said, people are shitty, right? And just because one person is shitty doesn't mean a whole institution is shitty, doesn't mean that a whole, religion is shitty. It's just sort of people in general. But I mean, religious trauma is definitely a thing, and there's all sorts of people talking about that. So I mean, so how was it going back to church, and have you been back since? Or was that a C and E, Christmas and Easter thing?
Yeah, we used to always joke about those people, right?
Yeah.
In the church.
Yeah.
I know that was something that my dad certainly joked about. Yeah, so like I mentioned, that service that I went to Christmas Eve was like a really profound experience for me.
Hmm.
My husband took me to a church that he had grown up in, so he had a childhood connection there. But I didn't know anyone. I'd never stepped. No one knew who I was, in terms of like, when people sort of know that you're a pastor and you walk in and they're like, hey, do you want to pray? Do you want to do this? Do you want to?
Do you want to do a reading? Do you want to lead? Yeah, exactly. Do you want to lead the choir? Do you want
No,
to play
I
the organ?
just want to be in the back pew, like just let me
Yep.
do my thing. And so that was it was the first time, like I said, since everything had really gone down at CFB Borden, that I really darkened the doorsteps of church again. And it was it wasn't like a Damascus Road experience, if you will. It wasn't like anything big like that in terms of fireworks and things, but it was an incredibly healing moment, because I was with my family, and there was love and acceptance and all of those things, and it was like, oh, I can feel those things again in the context of a religious service. And it was just, I mean, it was a United Methodist Church. That denomination doesn't really exist in Canada, but it was fairly close to what we would have understood in the United Church, and in terms of liturgy and all that kind of stuff. And it just happened to be like all of my favorite Christmas hymns were in that service, in that one service, which I know is a coincidence, but holy coincidences,
Maybe.
And so it was just like a really beautiful, peaceful moment for me with my family, and experiencing that again. Have been back since. Have even experienced like negative experiences with congregations when I was looking at applying for a church position south of the border, and had an encounter, if you will, with a board, like a church board that was. I mean, my dad used to say when I was growing up that some of the least religious people, or the least Christian or least Christ-like people, sit on church boards.
Yeah.
You could see him saying this, right? Like
I can.
it's exactly the truth. And but was able to sort of work through that because of the work that I had done with my therapist and all that kind of stuff, and not sort of be re-triggered by it.
Okay.
Which I think is another plug for EMDR, which is a very effective modality, because I was able to
Mm-hmm.
sort of do that, and it was like new neural pathway. We're not going to go down that road of being triggered. Are you familiar with Jason Bias's book on?
No, I don't think I've heard that.
It's not specifically about religious trauma, but he talks a lot about. It's called Faithful and Fractured.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's about sort of broken clergy,
Mm-hmm.
like specifically religious leaders that have just experienced various forms of trauma or hurt at the hands of the church or the congregations that they serve and things like that, and how to come back from that, which is another book that has given me a lot of hope in all of that. I met with him recently before my retirement. We went out for lunch and had a discussion about that, and it was another, just these little pieces of connecting with people and sort of rebuilding those relationships with the church and with the faith community and all that kind of stuff that's sort of been. See, I wish I had an answer, Jason. I wish that there was like this nice reply that I could give you that was like all wrapped up in a pretty bow that's like, here, do all of these things and your religious trauma will go away.
No, it doesn't work that way. And of course the problem is that everybody's trauma is different and everybody's path to recovery is different. It's not linear, and I'm sure you've experienced that. I mean, mine has sort of been all over the map. There are days where I'm just like, wow, I feel better than I ever have before. And then there are other days where I'm quite literally hiding in my closets, because the kids are too loud. So, but I don't know if you experienced this, but so like you, I had a lot of trouble accepting the diagnosis of PTSD because I thought, I'm a priest. Who the heck, what kind of priest gets PTSD? But the other thing too was that I looked at my symptoms of PTSD and I saw them as failings on my part, right? Like, if only I was a better administrator, if only I had thicker skin, if only I was more this or less that, then all these things wouldn't happen. And like so much of sort of mental illness, I had to hit a breakdown, right, where I was hospitalized with suicidal ideation, and I was on the psych ward for 2 weeks, and then it occurred to me, I'm like, maybe something is wrong. But if I look back, prior to that, there was a lot of drinking, there was a lot of yelling at family members, there was a lot of punching walls, and a lot of doing all sorts of other stuff that was damaging. So, I mean, what was it that tipped you off to the idea that, okay, there's a big problem going on in Sarah land?
So I cheated a little bit, right? So there's a couple of things that happened all at one time. One of the things was that being an active service member in the Canadian Armed Forces, have a lot more resources available in terms of mental health and psychosocial support than I would say the average civilian would have access to. Now I know there's a lot that's publicly documented about the lack of resources in the military, certainly in terms of the level of trauma that exists, vice the resources that are available on some bases. They have a hard time having enough like psychiatrists, psychologists, et cetera, et cetera. There can be long wait times. But if you compare those to what a civilian would be facing in a community, like from a community service provider, we're extremely lucky in terms of the services that are available in the military. And that is really, really well communicated now. I know every chaplain intro brief that I ever did in the 9 years that I served included all of the phone numbers, which is like 24/7. You have 24/7 crisis counseling available to you. You have 8 free sessions a year with a community service provider, so completely separate from the military, like health system, if you will, that you can just skip that process altogether. You don't have to go and have anything on your medical file, and just get free counseling in the community, 8 sessions per year. And it doesn't or anything, but you get 8, then the next year you get another 8, and the next year you get another 8. And then there's also psychosocial support and actual mental health at the clinic. So there's a lot, right?
Okay.
And having in a position of privilege as a chaplain, knowing that, as soon as what happened with my supervisor went down, and I reported to my chain of command and got very little traction and very little action, I sort of preemptively went and was like, we're going to need help to process this.
Okay.
Access resources before it got to that point. Because and then it still kind of got to that point though, because things got worse when they tried to like remove me from the base, and there was retaliation and things like that, and like some continuously horrible things happened after that. But then I was already in a position of having access to care, which helped a lot. I mean, like you said, everyone's trauma is different. I think everyone's how their trauma or mental health or disorders present is also different. I mean, there's like a DSM-5 for a reason. There's certain clinical things that are common and identifiable, but how that presents for various people can look really, really different. It can look, I mean, like I was talking about, in my case, like the inability to go to church or connect in terms of that faith community piece. I didn't get the anger so much in an external expression. I would say I really internalized it a lot more.
Okay.
And myself for a lot of what happened, and then sort of like the consequences that followed, right? For like, oh, I trusted the system. Like, why did I do that? I knew that it was broken, or what have you. So you play into a lot of that negative self-talk, etc.
Which is bullshit, of course, but it's still,
and know that. And like, we're both mental health practitioners, so we know that.
Yeah.
Which is another source of shame, right? That whole idea of like, well, I should know better. I should, like, physician, heal thyself. But it doesn't work like that.
Well, it's kind of like how they say doctors make like the worst patients, you know what I mean? I think sometimes mental health practitioners make the worst recipients of mental health resources, because we're just like, oh, I should be able to think my way out of this, or I know, you can't exactly do EMDR on yourself, but you could do CBT on yourself, or you could do, a few different things.
If you know too much about how it works, then it doesn't work.
Yeah, no, exactly.
CBT is super, super effective for most PTSD, like people that experience PTSD symptoms. And like that, there's tons of clinical studies about that. I walk in any therapist office that I walk into, I'm like, CBT is off the table. It does not work for me for whatever reason. I don't know. Been there, done that. We've tried it. Like, 2 stars. Do not recommend to family and friends. Highly recommend, especially if you have a diagnosis of PTSD. But for whatever reason, I was like, it just doesn't work for me.
Yeah, well, and for anybody listening, CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy, and it has become kind of like the gold standard for a lot of mental health practitioners, and many health practitioners sort of raise their eyebrow at that. It is effective for a number of things, but also not terribly effective for a bunch of other things, and it can be very individual. So, I know that a lot of EAP, for example, employee assistance programs, require practitioners to do CBT, and that's because you have 6 sessions to, basically work your shit out. And maybe that's okay for some people who just sort of have like a one-off situation that has kind of bummed them out. But I mean, if you're talking like childhood trauma, if you're talking like deep endemic stuff that you've been carrying for years, it's going to take more than 6 sessions to put yourself back together again, right?
And there's other things that if you only have a short period of time that also work, like radical acceptance therapy and
Yeah.
like there's more than one path to the mountaintop, if you will.
Yeah.
These are really
Yeah.
in the field of mental health.
Yeah. So that's it. So, anybody listening who is looking for mental health resources, there's so many different approaches, and you have to do a little bit of research. If you go on, let's say, Psychology Today, which is kind of like the Amazon for therapists, you can look in their profiles and see what modalities they practice, what their approaches are, and do a little bit of research, and Wikipedia is fine. Go to Wikipedia and just check out what CBT is about and just get a general idea. So I practice narrative therapy for the most part, which is story based, and lets people tell their stories and takes the aspects of their stories that are positive and try to amplify those, and take aspects of their story that are negative and try to diminish the negative impacts on themselves. So that works for a lot of people, doesn't work for a lot of other people, right? So and that's fine. So nice thing is that there's lots of other mental health practitioners out there, right?
I mean, playing on to that, the other thing that I think is really important to note is that finding a good therapist is a lot like dating.
Yeah.
Like I've had people in my office as a chaplain who have said, oh, I went to therapy one time and the therapist was junk, or either we didn't make a connection, or I didn't like them, or whatever, and therefore all. And it's like, well, but you didn't write off dating after one bad date, right? I mean, some people do, if it's bad enough.
Some people do.
But like, you need to actually kind of, I hate to say this, but like shop around to find
you do.
good connection. I was lucky in that the woman that I was referred to at the mental health clinic in Borden was immediately a really good fit. Because it is exhausting to start over with like a new person every time you go, and I appreciate and I want to validate that. But if that hadn't have been a good fit, one of the things that I would have done would have been like, okay, this isn't a good fit. I'd like to ask for someone else, please.
Yeah, that's it. And I mean, it takes a good fit with your therapist, and it takes a few sessions to sort of get into the swing of things. And like dates, there are good sessions and bad sessions. And a good session doesn't mean it's always going to be good, and a bad session doesn't mean it's always going to be bad. So, but that's the thing. You're always at liberty to, as you said, shop around. I actually like that, because you would shop around for like, you would be selective with who you date, and you might shop around for an accountant who understands, your particular financial needs and all that. So a therapist should be no different. They're not, we're not all created equal, right? We're all different. So now you said, so if I understand correctly, Sarah, you kind of like, preemptively, like preventative maintenance, you went out and sought out a therapist because you knew that what was going on was going to have an impact on you. So you said you did EMDR, and what other kind of treatments did you do? What did you do to kind of keep your mental health on as even a keel as possible?
Yeah, so I'm going to say it was a combination of my health team at CFE Borden, the therapy that I was like, for a time there, it was weekly. Like it was that, which is what we call weekly therapy for, I think a period of longer than 2 months is considered intensive therapy. So certainly intensive therapy. In my own life, we already talked about, like, church was sort of out, and that connection with the faith community was less. Certainly physical fitness is a huge part of that can't be really set aside. There was definitely a connection there in terms of just being consistent with going to the gym and getting my lifts in and doing the things that I needed to do to stay strong and healthy, which in turn, of course, has a positive effect on brain chemistry and all that kind of stuff. And just lots and lots of routine, like lots and lots of routine. And sometimes I know, like, one of the things that I struggle with when there's like a lot of stress in my life, eating sort of goes out the window. I'm like undernourished or underfed, or I forget meals, or I skip meals, or what have you, or I'm too sort of stressed to be able to eat. And sometimes it's like setting an alarm to remind yourself to have a meal or whatever, and focusing on foods that you'll both tolerate and that will nourish your body. I had a medical team in Borden that was really supportive of that. There was a combination of stress leave. There was a period of time where I had a doctor there who was a retired military, but he was a civilian, like he was a civilian doctor on contract or whatever, and just zero F's to give. Like this guy had no skin in the game, and was like, I'm going to actually write you a medical employment limitation that you can't go anywhere near your CO. Like, this is detrimental to your blood pressure, or whatever the case may be. So I was blessed in that sense of like the medical system working really, really well for me. I know it doesn't for everyone in the military, and that is an ongoing problem. Like the lack of resources that we talked about as well, and publicly documented, but still, as it is in the rest of the country, right? Like there is a shortage of physicians, there's a shortage of mental health practitioners, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers. It can sometimes be really hard to get in to see someone, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't advocate for ourselves in terms of getting the level of care that we need and deserve. If you're in that situation, you're stuck with a care provider that doesn't listen to you or isn't giving you what you need, then I would encourage people, especially your listeners, to advocate for change or getting a referral to someone else, getting this, things like that. You don't have to settle for what you're currently stuck with.
You don't have to settle. And the other thing too, and I hear this said a lot, and I feel it needs to be said more. You are the expert in many ways on what is going on in your life, and oh, there are your dogs. Okay, you're muted, but you can still hear me though, right? So one thing I was raised with was that doctors are always right, and you don't ask questions. The doctor says take these pills, you take those pills. The doctor says do this. If the doctor says you're fine, right? But a lot of the times, the medical system, as you noted, is so overloaded. There's a shortage of physicians. You don't often have the time to give the situations the attention that they particularly need. So, I have someone I know who is on the verge of a burnout, and it's so obvious she's on the verge of a burnout, and she went to her doctor and he said, you can tough it through. And, you want to shake a doctor like that. This person is saying they're having trouble coping, and you just basically told them to buck take a hot bath or walk it off or something like that, right? And it's often we need to rely on our own interpretations of what is going on. If you feel you are near the edge, then you sometimes need to push a little bit to get the care you need, to get the care you deserve. Your dogs are still barking?
They're like, anyone that walks by my house, they're like really, really defensive. No, and it's an interesting phenomenon because like we have a tremendous amount of healthcare available in Canada, right? And so we have coverage for a lot of these things. You can go see a doctor for free. You can get, a lot of people have EAPs, and they have coverage for mental health practitioners like through their work. Some provincial healthcare plans cover like crisis and urgent psychiatric, and But then the flip side of that coin is that there's a lack of resources and there's long wait times. Flip side of that of where I am right now is like pay out of pocket, or you're like dealing with a health insurance network, but you can get in almost instantly to see someone.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah
it's
and
like doesn't know the other. I don't know what a better system is.
Upsides and downsides to sort of either situation.
Yeah.
So Sarah, we're coming to the end here, and like I told you before we started, before I pressed record, I like to end on sort of a note of hope. So, I mean, you seem like you're doing very well, and I hope that's not just a facade. I don't think it is. But if someone listening is going through some of the things that you have been through, you didn't exactly come out and say it, but I know I felt a great deal of hopelessness when I had PTSD. I felt like my life was over. I felt I was never going to work again. I felt I was never going to make a meaningful contribution to my family, to my community, ever again. So I don't know if you had sort of similar feelings of hopelessness or helplessness, but someone who might be in a very dark place right now, what is a message of hope that you could leave for them?
I think the biggest thing that gave me hope was that acceptance that it was okay to not be okay, to not feel like it. Much like, when we talked about physical fitness training, there are days when you don't feel like going to the gym. There are days when you don't feel that sense of motivation, if you will, to like get up and do the hard things, right? And that just choosing discipline or motivation on those days. And really, I mean, it's a cliche. You've survived 100% of the horrible days that you've had in your life to this point. Certainly not everyone does, but it's that idea that it's gonna suck for right now, and maybe for a while, but that it does get better, and that it's possible to get better, and that you can, if you're someone who has experienced religious trauma, you can walk away from that faith community altogether and be completely okay. If getting back to that,
they're just defending you. They're keeping you safe. Bugs. Two bugs myself, and they spend a lot of time in the front hallway or looking out the front window. And anytime anybody walks by, and we're right in front of an elementary school, so there's like a half hour in the morning and a half hour in the afternoon where it's just bark, bark, bark all the time because kids are walking home or walking to school.
For sure.
So sorry, you were saying?
Yeah. So I mean, and then the other piece is that if getting back to that connection, in terms of faith community, is something that you want to work towards, and picking up a relationship with the God of your understanding again is something that is important to you, that it's possible. And that doesn't mean that everyone has to do it, or that that's what I'm advocating for, but just that if it's something that is meaningful for you and that you miss in your life, that you don't have to be without it.
That is a really good point, and I know, like you said, like you've gotten past 100% of the bad days that you have lived before, and you're still standing. One of the things that helped convince me of that was just amassing small victories, and I had to sort of scale down my expectations, because I went from being a hyper effective presence in a high needs parish, to all of a sudden, not even being able to feed myself. There were days where I didn't have the energy to get up and have a bowl of cereal, but get up and have a bowl of cereal and be like, okay, I did that today. If nothing else, I showered. If nothing else, I wore pants, like sometimes it's the small victories.
When things get hard in barbell training in the gyms of like Olympic lifting and stuff, we micro load. So instead of putting another 45-pound plate on, sometimes it's too much. Like a 2.5-pound plate. And so sometimes for the rest of life, micro loading is the way to go, right?
I think that is a great analogy. Fantastic. Well, Sarah, this has been an absolute pleasure to reconnect with you. Do stay on for a couple of minutes after I press stop so we can just debrief. But I really want to thank you for your transparency and your honesty, and thank you for sharing your story with us.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.